Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Leicester. My name is Henrietta O'Connor, and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Head of the College of Social Science, Arts and Humanities. I'm delighted to have been asked to introduce Professor Pamela Rogerson-Revell's inaugural lecture this afternoon, and to welcome you all. A benefit of being virtual is that people are able to attend wherever they are, and it's a pleasure to see that so many of you have been able to log on this afternoon. Today's event is an important part of the university's Centenary celebrations, and it's one of the first inaugural lectures in the series from our college. 100 years ago marked the start of our story and legacy as a university to honour those who made sacrifices during the Great War. Thank you for joining us to mark this historic milestone and to celebrate the new chapter in Pamela's career. Pam joined the University of Leicester in 2001, and she's currently co-director of Teaching and Learning and the long-standing co-director of the Distance MA in Applied Linguistics and TESOL programme. Before joining Leicester, Pamela worked in several other British universities, as well as spending 4 years at City University in Hong Kong. Before moving into higher education, she worked for 10 years in corporate language training in Europe and Africa. She therefore has a strong research interest in the use of English as an international language, or lingua franca, particularly in business context. Pam's been the UK lead in 3 EU-funded projects in the field of international business communication, all of which contribute to European initiatives to enhance workforce mobility. She's also worked for many years as a consultant for the EU Research Executive Agency, evaluating Marie Curie research fellowships. In this lecture, Professor Rogerson-Revell shares her fascination with language, and in particular with how we speak. Drawing on her work in applied linguistics, she'll explore the role pronunciation plays not only in ensuring intelligibility in communication, but also in how we judge and are judged by others. Before passing over to Pam, please welcome Professor Chris Wilkins, Head of the School of Education, who would also like to say a few words.
Thank you. I'm Chris Wilkins, Head of the School of Education, and it's a huge privilege for me today to introduce an outstanding member of our community of scholars, Professor Pamela Rogerson-Revell. Pam is an applied linguist of international standing. She's known and respected in equal measure for her significant contribution to research in the field, for her innovative teaching and programme development, particularly in the field of online and distance learning, and as important as all of these, for her commitment to widening access to and participation in higher education. As a researcher, Pam's work has had a major impact in 2 aspects of linguistics and language learning of particular relevance to our world. Professor O'Connor has mentioned some of these. Her work on the focus of the use of English as a lingua franca for international business communication has been truly significant, and the major contribution to her field with her socio-linguistic approach to research in phonology and pronunciation. I've always been particularly attracted to scholarship that takes us on the journey to explore and understand ideas that most of us feel intuitively, perhaps, but superficially to make sense, which is why a lecture with the title "It's Not What You Say, It's the Way That You Say It" is such an enticing prospect. Pamela's research takes us deep into this idea and the idea of exploring intelligibility and the judgment of others and ourselves. Furthermore, Pam's research on phonology and pronunciation and on technology-enhanced language learning has shaped her approach to teaching. She's been a trailblazer in embedding online and distance learning pedagogies. The introductory applied linguistics and TESOL program she created in 2018 as a MOOC, a free open access online course, has had over 38,000 participants in 160 different countries. And again, Professor O'Connor has mentioned the work that Pamela is doing for the British Council currently, this commitment to widening participation and access, currently investigating the impact of the University of Leicester's English language teaching provision for refugees as part of the university's Sanctuary initiative across the UK. So all in all, it is with my great pleasure and immense pride to introduce Professor Pamela Rogerson-Revell.
Thank you very much, Henrietta and Chris, for that very kind and generous introduction. Hello and welcome everyone who can join me today. It's a pity we couldn't meet face to face in Leicester, but at least being online gives some people the opportunity to attend who wouldn't otherwise be able to do so. Before I start my lecture, I'd like to say a few words about applied linguistics. Some people sometimes ask me what I do, and I say I'm an academic, and then they might ask what area I work in. I say at linguistics or applied linguistics. And the next question might be, oh, really, how many languages do you speak? And at this point, I often see a slight hesitation or disappointment at my reply if I say, oh, English and French and a smattering of German and Spanish. I think the confusion is with the term polyglot, which means someone who speaks lots of languages. A linguist, on the other hand, or an applied linguist, is someone who analyzes and describes languages, whether it's a single language or comparing languages. An applied linguist, in particular, also looks at the social context in which a language is used and possibly how a language changes. My own particular area of interest in applied linguistics is phonology and phonetics, the sound system of a language. This obviously has applications to teaching and learning, but I'm also interested in the use of people's pronunciation and how people speak in international communication. And the third area I'm interested in is in how people's voice and the way that we talk to each other can create an impression, vocal styling. So that's what I'd like to talk about today, and I'll now move to my slides. So the title of my talk today is Not What You Say, It's the Way That You Say It, Some Excursions in Applied Linguistics. And here's an outline of what I'd like to talk about. First of all, I'd like to say a little bit about why I'm fascinated with language and with pronunciation in particular. And then I'll talk about what pronunciation does, both linguistically and socially. Then I'll try to explain why I think pronunciation is important by looking at three particular areas: accent, international intelligibility, and vocal styling. And I'll try and also explain why I think pronunciation is important for teaching and learning. So I thought one way perhaps of explaining my growing fascination with language and pronunciation was to talk a little bit about my own journey or excursions in terms of my career. So my first job as an English language teacher was in Spain. And I quickly realized that my 1 year of basic Spanish at school didn't get me very far in Catalan-speaking Spain. I then moved to Paris and similarly found that even with A-level French, I needed to learn a lot more to be able to communicate fluently with people out in the streets. I then moved to the west coast of Africa, to Gabon, which is on the equator. It's a French-speaking country, and I was working there for Shell, the Anglo-Dutch oil company, which uses English as its international language. And a couple of things are particularly pertinent there. One was that the French spoken in Gabon was quite different to the pronunciation in particular of the French spoken in France. And another incident which I remember well was at one point I was teaching a group of petroleum engineers, and one of them was Nigerian. And I was asked to improve the pronunciation of the Nigerian engineer. Obviously, in Nigeria, English is a national language, so people are quite fluent in English and understand each other perfectly well. The problem was that in an international context, with other native and non-native speakers of English, a lot of people found him quite difficult to understand. But I found this quite difficult to deal with, given that, as I say, in his own language, his English and his pronunciation was perfectly acceptable. I then moved back to Europe, where I spent quite a few years teaching English in company, particularly in business contexts. And one of the things that struck me regularly was that very often the business clients from the Northern European countries, including Scandinavia and Finland, Germany, and the Netherlands, were often perceived as being more proficient or more fluent in English than those from, for example, countries like France, not necessarily France, but Italy and Spain. And sometimes this wasn't necessarily because their language was better in terms of grammar or vocabulary, but because their pronunciation seemed better. And this is often because languages like Swedish and German and Norwegian are phonologically closer to English than languages like Italian or Spanish. And therefore, they were perceived as speaking better in terms of pronunciation. I then moved to Hong Kong, where I spent 4 years as a lecturer at City University of Hong Kong. And I was lucky enough to work with some well-known applied linguists, including Professor Jack Richards, Vijay Bhatia, John Flowerdew, Martha Pennington. And it was a great time to be in Hong Kong as an applied linguist. Again, a couple of things are in my memory from that period. One was that, like many expats, I tried to learn Cantonese and failed miserably. I did try and learn a particular phrase. I tried to learn how to say City University of Hong Kong, so that when I was in a taxi driver would know where to take me. But this very rarely succeeded, whether it's because my tones were completely wrong, or whether the taxi drivers were just so surprised to hear someone English trying to speak Cantonese. I don't know, but it didn't work. I came back to Europe and I've spent 20 years working at Leicester, and many of my students are international students working on master's or doctoral programs. And I'm frequently impressed by the quality of their English. The fact that they can study in a foreign language never ceases to amaze me. But nevertheless, some of the international students do still struggle with oral English and with pronunciation, particularly when they first arrive in this country. So I think perhaps now you can see why I think pronunciation is important. It's the basis, it's the building block of all other levels of language. If you don't produce sounds which are understandable, then people can't understand the syllables you say, the words, the phrases, and the general meaning of a message. So pronunciation is the gatekeeper to understanding language. And it doesn't matter how good your grammar or vocabulary is, if your pronunciation isn't clear enough, people won't understand what you're saying. However, unlike other languages, other areas of language, pronunciation is very closely bound up with our attitudes, our sense of identity, and emotions. The first thing that happens when we open our mouth and speak is we give an impression of ourselves. So we create an auditory impression. That hence the title of my talk. It's not what you say, it's the way that you say it. So I'd like to move on now to talk a little bit about what pronunciation does both linguistically and socially. Linguistically, of course, pronunciation is essential to distinguish word level meaning. So the difference between words like bin and ban is simply one small vowel sound in the middle, the I and the A. Similarly, the distinction between tap and tab is one small phonetic difference between how we pronounce p and b. Again, at the level of grammatical meaning, the words use and use are the same in writing orthographically, but there's a small difference in the pronunciation of the s sound between the noun use and the verb use. Similarly, the words advice and advise are distinguishable only by that sound of the S. The words present and present are the same in writing, but the noun present has the stress on the first syllable and the verb present has the stress on the second syllable. At the higher level of phrases, we can use our intonation, our pitch, to distinguish our intended meaning. So in a phrase like, I thought it was going to rain, and I thought it was going to rain. In the first one, it didn't rain, and in the second one, it did. Looking at the social meaning of pronunciation, again, how we speak is very closely bound up with our sense of identity, both at the level of our individual identity and group identity. So, do you have a similar voice to anyone else in your family? My voice is quite similar to my sister's, and sometimes we get mistaken for each other on the phone. If you're talking to someone on the phone, can you identify them by their voice? If you hear someone on the phone that you don't know, can you get a reasonable idea of that person's age, sex, physical appearance? Again, quite a lot of research suggests that we can do this quite accurately. Group identity is very much what we're talking about when we talk about accent. So do you say grass or grass, bath or bath? I say grass and bath, and my husband says grass and bath, and our son is completely confused because, again, these are regional markers of our accent, so very often related to which part of the country we've either grown up in or spent a considerable time in. But our accent isn't necessarily just a case of our geographical identity. It can also be related to social group or professional group or age group. So do you know anyone who says fin instead of thin? This is often a marker of a particular age group. Often teenagers use that particular sound, the th, to replace a th. Can you tell someone's emotional state or mood by the way they sound? Can you hear a smile on the phone? If someone says hello or says hello, can you guess what sort of mood they're in? So what I'm talking about here is the auditory impression we create by our voice, the sound of our voice. And we do this all the time. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is easy to fall into stereotypes and prejudices by the way someone sounds. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about why I think pronunciation is important for successful communication. And I look at three particular areas: being understood, being fluent, and making an impression. So, as I said earlier, we need a certain level of accuracy, clarity, and precision in the sounds that we make in order to be intelligible. And if we can't do that, then we won't get any further in terms of recognizing or being recognized in terms of what we're saying. But arguably, the level of precision and accuracy that we need in our speech varies depending on the context. So if you're in a noisy cafe with a friend, you may well not understand every single sound or phrase even that your friend is saying, but you'll get the overall gist and you'll understand certainly enough of the message in the cafe. However, the conversation between a pilot and an air traffic controller, I think we'd agree, it's essential that the communication between those two is entirely intelligible. And I'll come back to that later. Fluency is very closely bound up with our pronunciation. It's not only related to pronunciation, it's also related to how coherent our speech is. But in terms of pronunciation, it relates very closely to, for example, the speed of our speech, where we place the accent on different words or phrases, how we use rhythm and stress, and how we pause. And someone who speaks either too slowly or quickly, or pauses in unexpected places or for too long, can be perceived as either being linguistically not very competent, or being seen as irritating in some way. The use of our voice to make an impression is not an area that's given a lot of coverage, but I think it is an important aspect of pronunciation. And this is a quote from a book I wrote recently with my colleague Martha Pennington. More than any other aspect of language, pronunciation can have a crucial impact on evaluations, not only of an individual's communicative ability, but also on their social standing in terms of identity and status. Through our accent, tone of voice and voice quality, we convey a great deal about our social class and values, our emotional state and personality, and as a result, pronunciation can have a considerable impact on our lives. And I would also say that a high level of proficiency in pronunciation may compensate for linguistic deficiency in other areas, such as vocabulary or grammar. I'd just like to share with you an activity and the findings from a poll in our MOOC. A MOOC is a massive open online course. And as Chris said, I and my colleagues developed this MOOC a couple of years ago for anyone who's interested in applied linguistics. This particular unit is on pronunciation, and this activity asks the participants to listen to 6 audio clips and then decide which of the speakers they find the easiest to understand, which is the most fluent, and which makes the best impression on them. I won't share the audio clips with you, but I will share the findings of the polls. So I hope you can see here that in response to the questions, which of the speakers do you think is the most fluent and which makes the best impression, there's a great deal of overlap. In both cases, speaker 5 comes out top, followed by speaker 2. However, in terms of the question, which of the speakers do you find the easiest to understand, there's a slight difference. Speaker 2 is rated best, followed by speaker 5. So I think that suggests that while our perceptions of fluency and creating a good impression are obviously very closely related, being intelligible is a slightly different concept. And I think the concept of intelligibility is actually quite complex. It obviously requires a two-way effort between the speaker and the listener. It's not just the responsibility of the speaker. Also, quite a lot of research has suggested that intelligibility and accentedness, the degree of accent someone has, is not a straight correlation. So a speaker can have a strong accent and yet be clearly intelligible, and I'll come back to this. Nevertheless, foreign accented speakers are often perceived as less intelligible, less competent, and even less attractive than native speakers. So I'll talk a little bit more now about accent. And obviously I can't ask you face to face these questions, but perhaps you can consider them for a minute. So do you agree or disagree with these statements? Some languages sound better than others. Some accents are clearer than others. Some people don't have an accent. Your accent is for life. Pronunciation learners should aim for native-like accents. An accent has a strong relationship to intelligibility. And finally, do you have an accent? So I asked that very question again to the MOOC participants. And again, these are the responses. We asked the participants to say whether they're native speakers of English, what we sometimes refer to as L1 speakers, or non-native speakers, L2 speakers of English. And you can see that in both cases, the majority of the respondents did feel that they had a degree of accent. However, in terms of the strength of the accent, both native and non-native speakers felt that they didn't have a strong accent. And in both cases, the highest level of accent was around about 19%, which I think is quite interesting. So coming back to those questions about accent, everyone has an accent. The Queen has an accent. An accent just refers to how you speak in relation to those around you. So how close or different it is from the local group of speakers. And it can be either, as I've said before, a regional or social accent or a foreign accent. The issue is that some accents have a higher status or prestige than others, and very often those are the standard accents of a language. Also, an issue is that listeners typically assign attributes to speakers based on their accent. So in terms of whether they perceive someone as lazy or hardworking, attractive or unattractive, friendly or unfriendly, and lots of other attributes. Typically, high status standard accents are more highly rated in terms of an individual's competence or social standing, whereas regional accents, and as well rural regional accents, are often viewed more favourably in terms of social attractiveness. Accents change. The Queen's accent has changed, and the concept of a standard accent in England, for example, has changed. In the past, this was often referred to as RP, received pronunciation. Nowadays, there are only about 3 or 4% of the population that speak what we call standard RP. Someone like the politician Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example. So what is now a standard British English accent has changed from that variety. And also accent preferences change over time. So does accent matter? Well, listeners can detect accents incredibly quickly in as little as 30 milliseconds, and they can detect foreign accented speech particularly quickly. Also, research shows that exposure and familiarity with accent improves people's comprehension of an accent. However, on the negative side, accent has also been closely related to discrimination. And one survey of UK language attitudes found that a quarter of the British population felt that they had encountered accent discrimination at one point or other in their lives. There are also examples of where accent has had a negative impact on evaluations of asylum seekers and whether they've been admitted to their country of asylum or not. Similarly, research has been done on non-standard accents in America and found that people with non-standard American accents, particularly Afro-American accents, have not been given accommodation on the basis of their accents. There's also a lot of research, lots of examples of a positive relationship between prestige or high status accents and accents to high-level jobs and education. Okay, so moving on to accentedness and intelligibility. I mentioned this before. It is actually possible to be completely intelligible and yet be perceived as having a heavy accent, but the reverse doesn't happen. So speakers who are unintelligible will always be rated as having a heavy accent. And this graph here shows 9 speakers, all of whom were considered 100% intelligible, but you can see that they had different degrees of accent. So coming back to the question of does accent matter? Well, it seems that intelligibility and accentedness are partially independent. So accent can matter, but it doesn't necessarily have to in terms of intelligibility. Accent can be a positive marker in terms of our social identity and our group identity. However, it does have a dark side. And as John Levers says, 4 common consequences of accent or perceived accent are isolation, an unfair burden on second language speakers in terms of their communication, discrimination, and perceived stigma. So what does this mean for pronunciation, teaching, and learning? Well, you may have heard of the term accent reduction or neutralization, and you probably will have heard of elocution lessons, which were quite common until relatively recently in Britain. And this is the idea of getting rid of, erasing a regional or non-standard accent. And it's very much big business in many countries, particularly in the United States. More recently, applied linguists have suggested that we take a more positive view of adding a second language accent to our linguistic repertoire. So rather than seeing changing or adding an accent as threatening your first language accent, it can be seen as expanding and adding an accent to your repertoire. So moving on to the second area of language that I'm particularly interested in terms of pronunciation. This is international intelligibility. So in the world today, approximately 1.35 billion people speak English. That's approximately a quarter of the world's population. English is a language of global business and of many multinational corporations. Many universities around the world are using English as a medium of instruction, so even those not in English-speaking countries use English to teach their subject matter through. Many UK institutions are increasingly diverse in terms of language and culture. And I would argue that because of this increasing use of English as an international language, pronunciation plays a central role in maintaining intelligibility. So, again, just to put that in perspective, out of all of the users of English in the world, you can see that there are a lot more non-native users of English than native users of English, and suggested that only 4% of communication in English is between native speakers of English. So this has led to the growth of what's been called English as a lingua franca, the use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and often the only option. And it's been suggested that pronunciation problems regularly interfere with intelligibility in international contexts. Jennifer Jenkins is a well-known researcher in this field of English as a lingua franca, and she suggests that we might need some sort of core, some sort of international core to ensure intelligibility when communication is between non-native speakers of English. A core of pronunciation features which will ensure a minimal level of intelligibility. And this is what she means by this lingua franca core. She suggests that rather than trying to teach non-native speakers the whole repertoire of English pronunciation, we prioritize these core features. And this would include all consonants except th, the th and th sounds, which she doesn't think are essential for communication. Consonant clusters, so at the beginning of words like string and in the middle of the words restrict, she said these consonant clusters are important for intelligibility. The contrast between what she calls long and short vowels, so between sit and seat, are important, as is the stress placement in phrases like, it's not my pen. So beyond those core features, she would say that the others should not be given priority. She's not saying that we shouldn't teach them. She's saying that they should not take first priority. So sounds like th, different vowel contrasts. So in a word like cat, some speakers might say ket or cut, because in the first language that contrast doesn't exist. Weak form, so in a phrase like he went to work, we don't usually say he went to work, we say he went to work. But she says this is not essential for intelligibility. Word stress, so the difference between photograph and photographic. again, is considered non-essential, as is pitch movement and stress timing. So it must be emphasised that Jenkins is just talking about communication between non-native speakers here, but this, this suggestion has led to a lot of debate in the field of pronunciation learning and teaching. So I'd like to suggest that in some areas of international communication, accuracy and precision and intelligibility are particularly important. So I think one area is in health communication. And in many countries, including the United Kingdom and the United States, as I've said, the workforce is becoming increasingly diverse, both in terms of language and culture. And quite a lot of research has suggested that this leads to, or can lead to, miscommunications both between medical staff, healthcare personnel and patients, and can lead to inappropriate or even harmful treatments. And patients with less proficient English can be at more risk of physical harm. Some research in this field has suggested that pronunciation can play a key role. This is research done by Celia Roberts and her colleagues, looking at a series of doctor-patient interactions in inner city London surgeries, and they found that pronunciation and word stress and intonation and speech delivery were the most important elements of miscommunications. Not much research has been done into healthcare professionals' language, but some research was looking at international medical graduates who want to come to Britain as doctors, but have to pass a clinical skills assessment before they can. And this particular piece of research suggested that the lower success rates were partly due to difficulties not with pronunciation per se, but with rhythm and intonation, which led to a perception, in this case, that sometimes the students didn't sound very empathetic. So the second area where I think aviation communication is particularly important is, where I think intelligibility is particularly important is aviation. And there are quite a few cases where crashes, the reason for crashes seems to be attributable, at least to some extent, to communication issues. And this has resulted in a series of recommendations being made to do with the clarity of language, and in particular to pronunciation. And I won't go into details here, but it also suggests that the responsibility for clear communication lies not only with the non-native speakers, but also with the native speaking air traffic controllers and pilots to make sure and accommodate their language in these particular contexts. And this is an area, in fact, that one of my own PhD students is working on at the moment. Moving on to the third, a third area where I think communication is in English relies quite heavily on clear pronunciation is in international business. And this is an area which I've researched quite a lot myself. This case study refers to a European organization which contacted me because they felt that although the majority of their members are non-native speakers, not enough of them contribute in international meetings, and they wanted to work out why this was the case. My research suggested that this was in fact happening, that there were quite a few non-native speakers of English who were inactive in the meetings, although there are no doubt a variety of reasons for this. I conducted various questionnaires to find out what might be happening, And I asked the native speakers of English if they had any difficulties understanding other speakers in international meetings. And obviously there were some difficulties, but on the other hand, quite a lot of responses suggested that as they became acclimatized and accustomed to non-native speaker accents, they became easier to understand. I also asked the non-native speakers if they had any difficulties understanding people in meetings, and you can see here some of their responses. Quite frequently, they referred again to aspects of delivery, such as the speed of speech or the volume of speech. I also asked the native speakers of English if they felt they needed to modify their English in international meetings. And it was quite surprising, the level of awareness of the need to modify how they talked in these meetings. They need to adjust the speed of their speech, the clarity of their speech, and also to try and avoid metaphors and nuances when they spoke. So I will try and play you one audio extract here from one of the meetings, just to illustrate that this is a non-native speaker of English, a French speaker, who has a noticeable, I think, accent, but is nevertheless quite intelligible.
It's becoming a multi-section questionnaire. It starts with a general questionnaire and general questionnaire on several types of risk.
So something else that I did with these meetings was to look at how quickly people were speaking. And the findings were quite surprising. There was a clear cutoff point between the native and the non-native speakers. So on average, the native speakers spoke faster than the non-native speakers. So what does this mean to the company and more broadly for teaching and learning pronunciation? Well, I think second language speakers who lack confidence in their pronunciation proficiency will naturally be reluctant to speak up. Using a second language does generally seem to slow speakers down, and the lower speech rate does unfortunately sometimes result in negative perceptions of fluency. Accented speech may be difficult to understand, but it's not necessarily the case. And I think delivery features such as speed of speech, volume, and pausing can also be important, along with fluency and intelligibility. Modifying strong accents, I think, is something that both second and first language speakers need to be aware of. And similarly, I think both second and first language speakers need to try to develop their what I call accommodation strategies, ways that they can modify the way that they can speak to make themselves clearer in international contexts. So I'm going to move on to my third and final area of interest. This is what I refer to as vocal styling, the way that we can use our voice and our speech to create a particular impression and develop rapport with others. So I think pronunciation in its broadest sense, including accent, voice, and delivery, is an important aspect of the way that we speak, our speech style or vocal style. So just as we can change the way that we dress, or the way that we look, we can change our vocal style. And we do this maybe if we tell a joke or speak to children, put on a silly voice in a temporary way. But sometimes people do it on a more permanent basis. And just to give you some examples, you may recognize some of these individuals. David Beckham, Mick Jagger, and Tony Blair. And I think they're particularly interesting in the sense of whether they change their voice by what I call upstyling or downstyling. Upstyling refers to shifting your style of speaking towards a more prestige group, whereas downstyling is shifting it towards a less prestigious group. So David Beckham is well documented as changing his voice and having what we call voice work to make him sound posher. So he's lost some of his Cockney accent. He's originally from the east of London. Mick Jagger and Tony Blair, on the other hand, both come from well-educated middle-class backgrounds, and both have been documented at various points in their careers as shifting their voices and way of speaking to a more everyday, if you like, working class style of speech. So it's interesting to consider why they may do that. Someone else who's a good example of vocal styling, who's had voice work during their career, is ex-British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And again, it's well documented that she changed her voice considerably from when she first became a politician to later in her career. Early on in her career, her voice was typically quite feminine, quite high in pitch. And later on in her career, it was considerably lower. And I'll see if I can play these audio clips.
And an upbringing, you had to do well yourself to do better. And therefore one had to go on to university, one had by one's own efforts to get as good a job as possible, and one really had to work and work extremely hard. But at that age, it never occurs to you that you can't achieve your ambitions.
Okay, and the second one.
Mrs. Thatcher, I am saying that it was on a bearing 280, which is a bearing just north of west. It was already west of the Falklands, and therefore nobody with any imagination can put it sailing other than away from the Falklands.
I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Mrs. Gould.
Mrs. Gould.
When
the orders were given to sink it, and when it was sunk, it was in an area which was a danger to our ships.
Well,
now, you accept that, do you?
No, I don't.
I'm sorry, it was.
Okay, well, I hope you can see, I think one of the main differences there is, as I say, the shift downwards in Margaret Thatcher's pitch. And also the difference between her pitch in the second clip and the other speaker's pitch. One thing you can't see because I haven't got the video, but you might be able to see from the images here that she's learnt to use gaze much more intently in the second clip and in her later voice. She uses what we call controlled pauses. So she pauses in places for dramatic effect, and she uses quite long pauses, and she uses a very emphatic style of speech. Someone else that I think you'll be familiar with, ex-president of the United States, Donald Trump, is someone who certainly hasn't changed their vocal style, and I think is unlikely to take advice to change his speech style. And I think there are very good reasons why he, in fact, has kept his accent. He's kept his New York working class accent, despite having had quite a high level of education. He's kept his New York Queens accent. He uses a very emphatic speech style, very short phrases, frequent pauses, and a lot of emphatic stress and gesture. He has quite a limited range of grammar and vocabulary and uses a lot of repetition in words and phrases. And all of these features are characteristic of what's been called high involvement or conversational style, a style which is used to create rapport or proximity to the people you're talking to. And in Donald Trump's case, proximity to his target voters. And I think he has done this to distance himself from the traditional political establishment. And this anti-establishment image that he creates partly through his speech and vocal styling, I would argue has been central to his political campaign and his electoral success. So, what does this mean in terms of teaching and learning pronunciation? I hope that you will agree with me that pronunciation involves a lot more than learning a set of standard sounds, although that is obviously fundamental. Pronunciation is key not only for intelligibility, but also for perceptions of how proficient we are, how competent we are, how confident we feel, and our status. Intelligibility, I would argue, is not necessarily related to accent, although it can be, and accent is not necessarily problematic. I think voice and delivery could be given a lot more time and importance than they generally are. Because pronunciation is so closely related to our sense of identity and attitudes and emotion, it can be quite challenging to learn. However, competence, I think, in pronunciation, or one area of pronunciation, can be one way of compensating for a lower level of competence in another area. Learning the pronunciation of a new language can be seen positively as accent addition rather than accent reduction. And I think this is one way of getting away from the issue of seeing learning a new accent or pronunciation as a threat to your first language identity. I think both native and non-native speakers need to be aware of the role they play in effective communication and need to develop accommodation strategies, ways of modifying and adjusting the way that they speak to the context. And related to that, we need to develop tolerance and exposure to different varieties of English. So, in conclusion, as the world becomes more and more interconnected and workplaces become more diverse, the importance of raising awareness of effective communication increases. People need to be able to accommodate linguistic and phonological variation, and they need to know how to speak as clearly as possible to a potentially highly linguistically diverse community. However, as well as needing to ensure mutual intelligibility, people want to maintain their linguistic distinctiveness through their communicative style and accent. These issues and challenges are what continue to fascinate me about language in general, but also about pronunciation in particular. I hope I've managed to share some of that fascination with you too. So I'll end my lecture there, and I'd like to hand you back to Henrietta. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pam. That was a wonderful insight to your work and a skillful presentation, weaving your enviable experience of working in different countries with your own research and teaching expertise. I think you really brought to life this subject matter in a really accessible and enlightening way. I can't help but feel really self-conscious now about my own accent, and it's made me reflect, which I'm sure the whole audience are reflecting, on accents in my own family. All three of my children are Leicester born and bred. One of them has a really pronounced Leicester accent and the other two barely have a trace of it. I'm going to think about this now in much more detail. You've given us all a great deal to think about. If we were in normal times, I'd now be able to ask you to join me in a huge round of applause to thank Pam for such a fantastic lecture. So Pam, I'm going to ask you to just take a moment to visualise and imagine the round of applause you would be receiving from your audience right now if we were here in person. I'd also be able to invite everyone to join us for a reception and the opportunity to continue this conversation. And I'm sorry that we can't extend that invitation today, given the virtual nature of the event. But all that remains is for me to thank Pam again on behalf of everyone, and to thank all of you for joining us here this afternoon. Thank you very much.